On a freezing February morning in 1958, Sister Mary Catherine sat in the dim basement library of St. Bartholomew's Monastery in upstate New York, carefully cataloging a collection of donated books that had arrived the previous week. The stone walls around her had witnessed 3 centuries of contemplative silence, and she expected this Tuesday to be no different from any other. She had no reason to suspect that within the next hour, her life of quiet devotion would collide with one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence operations ever conducted on American soil. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Sister Mary Catherine was 42 years old that winter, a woman who had taken her vows 20 years earlier after a childhood marked by the chaos of the Great Depression. Her parents had been Polish immigrants who settled in Buffalo, working in the steel mills that lined the shores of Lake Erie. Her father, Joseph, had been a skilled machinist who could read blueprints and technical diagrams with the same fluency that other men read newspapers. Her mother, Anna, had worked as a seamstress, her fingers flying over fabric with remarkable precision. They had raised their only daughter with a deep reverence for education and faith, scrimping and saving to ensure she could attend the Catholic school run by the Sisters of Mercy. Young Catherine Kowalski had been an exceptional student, displaying particular aptitude for mathematics and languages. She had learned Polish at home, English at school, and taught herself Latin by the age of 14 so she could read the Mass in its original form. Her teachers had encouraged her to pursue university education, perhaps to become a teacher or even a professor. In 1934, she had been accepted to a women's college in Massachusetts with a partial scholarship, a remarkable achievement for the daughter of immigrant factory workers. But the summer before she was to leave for college, something had shifted within her. She had been attending daily Mass, seeking guidance about her future, when she felt what she could only describe as a profound call to religious life. The feeling was not dramatic or accompanied by visions, but rather a deep, settled certainty that her path lay not in academic achievement or professional success, but in service to God within a contemplative community. Her parents had been initially dismayed, having invested so much hope in her education, but they ultimately supported her decision with the same faith that had sustained them through years of hardship. She entered St. Bartholomew's Monastery in September of 1938, just as Europe was sliding toward war. The monastery had recognized her intellectual gifts almost immediately and, after her novitiate period, assigned her to assist the elderly Sister Agatha, who had maintained their extensive library for 40 years. Sister Agatha had been a brilliant scholar in her own right, holding a doctorate in medieval history from a German university, and she had trained Sister Mary Catherine in the exacting work of cataloging and preservation. When Sister Agatha passed away in 1946, Sister Mary Catherine had inherited her role, becoming the keeper of a collection that included rare manuscripts, theological texts, and historical documents dating back to the 17th century. The library was her domain, her sanctuary within the sanctuary. She knew every volume, every manuscript, could locate any text within minutes, regardless of how obscure the request. She had developed systems for preservation and cataloging that drew on the latest library science methods while respecting the traditional organization that centuries of librarians before her had established. Her work was solitary but deeply satisfying, a perfect marriage of her intellectual gifts and her spiritual calling. The donation that arrived that week came from the estate of a man named Arthur Pemberton, a retired State Department official who had died suddenly of a heart attack in his Manhattan apartment 3 weeks earlier. Pemberton had been a regular donor to the monastery over the years, contributing generously to their charitable works. His executor, a nephew who lived in Chicago, had arranged for the man's personal library to be sent to St. Bartholomew's, noting in his letter that his uncle had specifically requested this in his will. The boxes contained roughly 200 volumes, mostly history books, political treatises, and religious texts that Pemberton had collected during his 30-year career in diplomatic service. Sister Mary Catherine approached the task with her usual methodical precision. She had developed a system over her years as librarian, first examining each book for condition, then checking for inscriptions or marginalia that might provide historical context, and finally cataloguing them according to the Dewey Decimal System before shelving them in their proper place. The work was solitary and contemplative, exactly the kind of labor that suited her temperament. Most of the books were unremarkable. She found first editions of works by Reinhold Niebuhr and Jacques Maritain, several volumes on European diplomatic history, and a substantial collection of books about Eastern Orthodox Christianity that suggested Pemberton had maintained a scholarly interest in Russian culture. Many bore his bookplate, a simple design featuring his initials and the Latin phrase Veritas liberabit vos, truth will set you free. Some contained brief marginal notes in his neat, precise handwriting, observations about particular passages or cross-references to other works. It was late in the afternoon, as the winter light fading through the basement windows turned the color of steel, when Sister Mary Catherine picked up a leather-bound Bible that had been packed near the bottom of the fourth box. The volume was a King James version, published in London in 1935 by Oxford University Press. The binding showed significant wear, the leather cracked along the spine, and the gilt edging on the pages had worn away in places from frequent handling. This suggested it had been well used, which struck her as somewhat unusual given that Pemberton had also owned several other Bibles in better condition. She opened the cover and found Pemberton's bookplate affixed to the inside front board, along with a handwritten inscription that read, "To Arthur, in appreciation for your dedicated service. May you find guidance in these pages. With gratitude, Thomas." There was no date and the surname was omitted, but the formality of the phrasing suggested a professional rather than personal relationship. Sister Mary Catherine made a note to include this provenance information in her catalogue entry. As she began her standard examination, flipping through the pages to check for damage or loose bindings, something caught her attention. Throughout the book, certain words had been faintly underlined in pencil. The marks were subtle, barely visible unless the page was held at a particular angle to the light, and they had been made with such a light touch that they would have been easy to miss entirely. At first, she assumed this was simply evidence of Pemberton's Bible study, perhaps marking passages that held particular meaning for him. But as she examined more pages, a high pattern began to emerge that troubled her methodical mind. The underlined words did not seem to correspond to complete verses or even coherent phrases. Instead, individual words were marked seemingly at random throughout different books of the Bible. In Genesis, she found station underlined in chapter 3, verse 8. In Exodus, the word blueprint appeared marked in chapter 25, verse 9. In Leviticus, steel was underlined in chapter 26, verse 19. Sister Mary Catherine felt a small flutter of unease in her chest. She had spent 2 decades examining books, and she had developed an instinct for recognizing when something was not quite right. This pattern felt deliberate, but its purpose eluded her. She continued flipping through the pages, now searching specifically for the underlined words, and found them scattered throughout both the Old and New Testaments. There was no apparent theological significance to the marked words, no thematic connection that would explain why someone engaged in religious study would highlight precisely these terms. She sat back in her chair, the Bible open on the desk before her, and tried to think through what she was seeing. The monastery was quiet around her, the only sound the distant clang of pipes as the heating system fought against the February cold. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, the flakes visible through the small basement windows, accumulating on the stone sills. The lamp on her desk cast a pool of yellow light that seemed inadequate against the gathering darkness of the winter evening. Her mind turned to possibilities. Could this be some kind of personal code or memory aid? She knew that people sometimes developed idiosyncratic systems for marking important passages. During her years managing the library, she had seen Bibles marked in countless ways, from elaborate color-coding systems to complex cross-referencing schemes. Some people underlined verses that spoke to them during difficult times. Others marked passages they wanted to memorize or share with others. But those systems had a logic, a spiritual or devotional purpose that was evident even when the specific meaning was personal. These markings had no such logic. The words seemed chosen almost randomly, with no theological significance whatsoever. Station, blueprint, steel. These were not words that appeared in commonly memorized verses or inspirational passages. They did not correspond to the Beatitudes or the Ten Commandments or the Psalms that people typically marked for contemplation. Then another thought occurred to her, one that made her pulse quicken slightly and her hands grow cold despite the warmth of the library. She had read in the newspapers about espionage cases, about Soviet agents operating in America. The Rosenberg trial had dominated headlines 7 years earlier. The execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg for passing atomic secrets to the Soviets had shocked the nation. There had been other cases since then, some publicized and others only whispered about. The newspapers had reported that spies used various methods to conceal messages, including invisible ink, microdots so small they could be hidden in the period at the end of a sentence, and codes embedded in seemingly innocent communications. She remembered a particular article she had read in Time magazine, back in 1953, about how intelligence agencies used book codes, where the words of a published text could be used to conceal messages through various marking systems. The article had been part of a series about the shadow war between American and Soviet intelligence services, the hidden conflict that paralleled the public tensions of the Cold War. At the time, she had read it with the detached interest of someone encountering an exotic world, utterly foreign to her own experience. Now, holding this Bible with its mysteriously underlined words, that exotic world suddenly felt terrifyingly close. Could these markings be some form of code? Could Arthur Pemberton, a State Department official who had donated generously to their monastery, who had requested that his books be given to the church, actually have been involved in espionage? The thought seemed almost absurd as soon as it formed. She tried to dismiss it, to find some more innocent explanation. Perhaps Pemberton had been studying linguistics and was tracking word frequencies. Perhaps he was working on some kind of concordance project. Perhaps the marks had been made by someone else entirely, a previous owner of the Bible whose identity was lost to history. But even as she generated these alternative explanations, her analytical mind was rejecting them. The pattern was too consistent, too systematic to be random or coincidental. Someone had carefully selected these specific words and marked them in a way designed to be subtle, almost invisible. That degree of care and concealment suggested purpose, suggested something that needed to be hidden. Sister Mary Catherine felt the weight of decision pressing upon her. She was a woman who had deliberately chosen a life removed from the complexities and conflicts of the secular world. The monastery walls represented not just physical boundaries but a spiritual separation, a commitment to focus on eternal rather than temporal concerns. The great events of the world, the political struggles and international tensions, were things she prayed about but did not directly engage with. Yet here she sat, possibly holding evidence of espionage, of betrayal of her adopted country, by a man who had presented himself as a patriot. If her suspicions were correct, this Bible might contain information crucial to national security. People's lives might depend on the intelligence it revealed, the defense of the nation, the protection of innocence. These were not merely temporal concerns, but moral imperatives rooted in the same divine law that called her to religious life. She decided to approach the problem systematically, the way she would approach any complex research question. She took a fresh notebook from the drawer of her desk, one of the simple composition books the monastery purchased in bulk for various administrative needs. At the top of the first page, she wrote the date, February 18, 1958, and then analysis of Pemberton Bible KJV 1935 edition. She began writing down every underlined word she could find, along with the book, chapter, and verse where it appeared. The work was painstaking, requiring her to examine each page carefully in the failing light. She adjusted the lamp on her desk, angling it to catch the faint pencil marks. Some pages required multiple examinations before she could be certain whether words were marked or not. The person who had done this underlining had used the lightest possible touch, creating marks that were barely more than impressions on the paper. It was the work of someone who understood the need for concealment, who knew that the Bible might be examined casually, but wanted to ensure the markings would escape notice, unless someone was specifically looking for them. After the first hour, she had compiled a list of 63 words. She paused to rest her eyes, which had begun to ache from the strain of examining pages in the dim light. The bell for Compline, the final prayer service of the day, rang through the monastery. She heard the soft footsteps of her sister nuns making their way to the chapel. For a moment, she considered setting aside this work and joining them, maintaining her normal routine. But something held her in her chair, a conviction that this matter could not wait, that what she had discovered demanded immediate attention. She continued working, now moving through the Bible more quickly as she developed a better eye for spotting the marked words. By 9 in the evening, she had examined the entire Bible and had a list of 147 words. She stared at the list, looking for any pattern or connection. The words themselves seemed deliberately varied: station, blueprint, steel, harbor, midnight, threshold, compass, voltage, 17, chamber, westbound, document, frequency, cipher, protocol, installation, personnel, coordinates, classified, transmission, underground, contact, package, delivery, surveillance, technical specifications, Atlantic submarine, reactor, plutonium, laboratory, schedule, deployment, encryption, source, asset, handler, operation, network, security, clearance, access, facility, research, development, weapons, systems, production, capacity. As she read through the list, her skin prickled with recognition. These were not random words. They were the vocabulary of espionage and military intelligence. Words like asset, handler, and contact had specific meanings in the world of spies. Words like plutonium, reactor, and weapons suggested nuclear secrets. Words like submarine and deployment is an Atlantic pointed to naval intelligence. Sister Mary Catherine felt a wave of nausea wash over her. This was not some academic code or innocent memory system. This was real espionage, real betrayal of the most serious kind. Arthur Pemberton had been passing information to the Soviets about America's most sensitive military secrets, and he had been using a Bible, the sacred text of Christianity, as his means of concealment. The blasphemy of it struck her almost as hard as the treason. To take the word of God and corrupt it into a tool for deception and betrayal felt like a profound violation. She found her hands trembling as she held the notebook, as the full implications of what she had discovered began to crystallize in her mind. But she forced herself to remain calm, to continue thinking analytically. Simply having a list of suspicious words was not enough. She needed to understand how they formed a message, how the code actually worked. She looked at the biblical references again, studying the chapter and verse numbers for each marked word. There had to be a key, some system that would tell the person receiving this Bible how to read the message hidden in the underlined words. She thought about common cipher techniques she had read about. Some codes used the first letter of each word to spell out a message. But that would not work here. The first letters of these words did not form any coherent pattern. Some codes relied on numerical keys, using dates or other significant numbers to determine the order of decryption. The biblical references themselves might be the key. She began examining the chapter and verse numbers more carefully. What if the numbers determined the order in which the words should be read? She started arranging the words according to the sum of their chapter and verse numbers, creating a new list organized numerically. As she worked, a pattern began to emerge. Words that had similar chapter-verse sums seemed to belong together in a grammatical sense. At position 8, where the chapter and verse added to 8, she found submarine from one verse and Atlantic from another. At position 12, she found facility and Connecticut. At position 17, she found schedule and deployment. Her heart began to race. This was the key. The underlined words were meant to be read not in the order they appeared in the Bible, but in an order determined by the sum of their chapter and verse numbers. It was an elegant system, one that would be nearly impossible to detect without knowing the key, and one that could encode substantial amounts of information within a single Bible. She spent the next several hours reorganizing her list, calculating the chapter-verse sums for each word and arranging them in numerical sequence. When she had finished, the message began to reveal itself in chilling clarity. The words, read in the correct order, formed coherent phrases about military installations, naval operations, research facilities, and intelligence protocols. One section of the message, when properly decoded, read, Atlantic Submarine Facility. Connecticut houses ballistic vessels, scheduled deployment rotation 45 days, strategic deterrent patrol, classified coordinates. Another section mentioned New Mexico laboratory plutonium production capacity, underground installation, research, weapons development, highly classified, access restricted. Sister Mary Catherine sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. She was looking at evidence of espionage at the highest level, information that could only have come from someone with extraordinary access to America's most sensitive military and nuclear secrets. Arthur Pemberton had not been some minor functionary passing along rumors or speculation. He had been deep inside the machinery of national defense, systematically betraying information that could tip the balance of power in the Cold War. By now it was past 6 in the evening. The bell for Vespers rang through the monastery, calling the sisters to prayer. Sister Mary Catherine normally would have immediately set aside her work and made her way to the chapel, but she sat frozen at her desk, the implications of what she had discovered crashing over her like a wave. If this Bible contained coded intelligence information, then Arthur Pemberton had been involved in espionage. And if he had been a spy, the question became, for whom had he been working? She knew she should report this to someone, but to whom? The local police would likely dismiss it as the imaginings of a cloistered nun. The FBI seemed like the appropriate authority, but the thought of contacting them filled her with anxiety. She had lived her entire adult life within the peaceful walls of the monastery, deliberately removed from the turbulent world outside. The idea of involving herself in matters of national security seemed utterly foreign to her nature and calling. Yet she also understood that if her suspicions were correct, this was a matter of grave importance. The Cold War was not some distant abstraction, but a real conflict with real consequences. She thought of the newspaper stories about Soviet nuclear weapons, about the arms race, about the constant tension between East and West. If this Bible contained information that could help protect her country, did she not have a moral obligation to come forward? After Vespers, Sister Mary Catherine sought out Mother Superior Bernadette, the elderly nun who had led the monastery for the past 15 years. Mother Bernadette was 73 years old, a woman of formidable intelligence and unshakable faith, who had guided the community through the challenges of the war years and the uncertain peace that followed. Sister Mary Catherine found her in the small office adjacent to the chapel, working on correspondence by lamplight. When Sister Mary Catherine explained what she had found, Mother Bernadette listened without interruption, her weathered hands folded on the desk before her. Her face, deeply lined but still beautiful in its serenity, showed no surprise or alarm. When Sister Mary Catherine finished, there was a long silence broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, Mother Bernadette spoke, her voice measured and calm. She said that Sister Mary Catherine's discovery was indeed troubling and potentially significant. She noted that the monastery had always maintained a position of neutrality in worldly affairs, but that neutrality did not mean indifference to evil or injustice. If Arthur Pemberton had been involved in espionage, particularly espionage against the United States, then the information in that Bible might be crucial to national security. Mother Bernadette made a decision that night that would set in motion a chain of events neither of them could have anticipated. She instructed Sister Mary Catherine to continue her analysis of the Bible, to document everything she found with meticulous care. In the meantime, Mother Bernadette would reach out to their diocesan bishop, who maintained contacts in Washington, and could advise them on the appropriate way to handle such a sensitive matter. Over the next 3 days, Sister Mary Catherine barely slept. She worked in the library from dawn until late into the night, examining the Bible with increasing sophistication. She discovered that the underlined words followed a pattern based on the chapter and verse numbers. By reading the words in order according to a mathematical sequence, a cipher based on the biblical references themselves, she began to extract coherent messages. The breakthrough came on the 3rd night. She realized that if she arranged the words according to the sum of the chapter and verse numbers, patterns emerged. Words found in passages where the chapter and verse numbers added up to the same total were meant to be read together. It was an elegant system, one that would be nearly impossible to detect without knowing the key, and one that could encode substantial amounts of information within a single Bible. The messages she decoded sent chills down her spine. They contained references to military installations, the names of what appeared to be intelligence sources, dates and locations of meetings, and technical information about weapon systems. The detail was extraordinary and spoke to access at high levels of government. Arthur Pemberton had not been merely passing along gossip or rumor. He had been providing the Soviets with classified information of the highest order. One message she decoded with particular clarity mentioned a naval facility in Connecticut, including the designation of submarines based there and the schedule of their deployments. Another referenced a research laboratory in New Mexico with details about plutonium production that made her heart race, even though she barely understood the technical terms. A third message contained a list of names, 12 individuals identified only by what appeared to be code designations, along with notations about their positions and access to classified materials. On the fourth day after her initial discovery, 2 men arrived at the monastery. Mother Bernadette met them at the gate and escorted them to her office. They identified themselves as Special Agents Harrison and Caldwell of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The bishop had made the call, and the Bureau had responded with remarkable speed, sending 2 of their most experienced counterintelligence officers from the New York field office. Sister Mary Catherine met with them in the parlor used for visitors, a formal room with high ceilings and austere furnishings that reflected the monastery's commitment to simplicity. Special Agent Harrison was perhaps 50 years old, a tall man with graying hair and the kind of patient, observant manner that suggested he was accustomed to listening more than speaking. Special Agent Caldwell was younger, maybe 35, with sharp features and an intensity that made Sister Mary Catherine nervous. She showed them the Bible and explained her analysis. As she spoke, describing how she had discovered the underlined words and decoded the pattern, she watched their faces carefully. Harrison's expression remained neutral, professional, but she could see the recognition in his eyes. This was significant. Caldwell took extensive notes, asking detailed questions about the sequence of her discovery and her methodology. Harrison asked if she had shown the Bible or discussed her findings with anyone outside the monastery. She confirmed that only Mother Bernadette and the bishop were aware, and that the Bible had remained in her possession since the moment she had discovered the markings. Harrison nodded approvingly and said that her discretion had been crucial. If word of this discovery had leaked, it could have compromised an ongoing investigation or alerted other members of a potential spy ring. The agents spent several hours examining the Bible and reviewing Sister Mary Catherine's notes. Caldwell photographed each page containing underlined words, using a camera with specialized lighting to ensure the faint pencil marks would be captured clearly. Harrison asked Sister Mary Catherine to walk them through her decoding process, step by step, so they could understand exactly how the cipher worked. As the afternoon wore on, Harrison began to share some context that helped Sister Mary Catherine understand the significance of what she had found. He explained that the Bureau had suspected Arthur Pemberton of having Soviet connections for nearly 2 years, but they had never been able to gather sufficient evidence to confront him or make an arrest. Pemberton had been careful, extraordinarily so, and his sudden death had appeared to close the investigation without resolution. The Bible changed everything. It provided concrete proof of Pemberton's espionage activities, and more importantly, it contained intelligence about active operations and potential ongoing security breaches. The names and designations Sister Mary Catherine had decoded could help the FBI identify other Soviet agents who were still operating. The information about military installations could help authorities understand what classified information had been compromised and take steps to mitigate the damage. Harrison also revealed something that made Sister Mary Catherine's blood run cold. The inscription in the Bible, the one signed simply Thomas, was almost certainly from a Soviet intelligence officer, likely Pemberton's handler. The phrase about finding guidance in the pages was not merely religious platitude but instruction, telling Pemberton that the Bible would be used for coded communications. The gift had been both an operational tool and a symbol of the handler's control over his asset. Before they left that evening, Harrison asked Sister Mary Catherine if she would be willing to testify, if it came to that, about how she had discovered and decoded the Bible. He explained that the Bureau would need to build cases against anyone identified through this information, and her testimony about the Bible's origin and the decoding process might be necessary to establish the evidence chain. The thought terrified her. The idea of standing in a courtroom speaking about espionage and treason was almost incomprehensible. But she agreed, understanding that her duty extended beyond the monastery walls when the stakes were this high. Over the following weeks, Sister Mary Catherine continued to work with the FBI, helping them decode additional messages she discovered in the Bible and providing context about the materials from Pemberton's estate. The agents returned multiple times, always respectful of the monastery's routines and the need for discretion. Mother Bernadette ensured that Sister Mary Catherine's unusual work was accommodated, adjusting her schedule to allow time for the collaboration while maintaining her participation in the community's prayer life. The investigation that grew from Sister Mary Catherine's discovery became one of the FBI's most significant counterintelligence operations of the late 1950s. The information in the Bible led to the identification of 7 Soviet agents operating in the United States, including 3 individuals working within government agencies who had access to classified materials. 4 were arrested in coordinated raids in June of 1958, while the others fled the country before they could be apprehended. The case never became public knowledge. The FBI, working with the State Department and intelligence agencies, decided that revealing the full scope of the operation would compromise other ongoing investigations and potentially expose sources and methods. The arrested agents were quietly prosecuted under national security procedures, with their trials held in closed courtrooms. 3 were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms, while 1 agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Sister Mary Catherine learned these details gradually through carefully worded briefings from Harrison, who maintained contact with her throughout the investigation. He told her that the information she had uncovered had prevented significant damage to national security. The submarine deployment schedules, for instance, had been changed after her discovery, preventing the Soviets from exploiting that intelligence. The research facility in New Mexico had implemented new security protocols after realizing their information had been compromised. For Sister Mary Catherine, the experience was transformative in ways she struggled to articulate. She had entered religious life seeking withdrawal from the world's conflicts, seeking the peace of contemplative devotion. Yet God had placed this Bible in her hands, had given her the analytical gifts necessary to recognize the hidden messages, and had called her to action when she would have preferred silence. She came to understand that even within the monastery walls, even in a life dedicated to prayer and scholarship, she remained part of the larger human community with all its struggles and moral demands. The Bible itself became a classified exhibit, held in FBI custody as evidence. Sister Mary Catherine never saw it again after that day in February when she had handed it over to Agents Harrison and Caldwell. Sometimes, in quiet moments in the library, she thought about that worn leather binding and the secrets hidden in its pages. She thought about Arthur Pemberton, a man she had never met, who had betrayed his country while maintaining the appearance of respectability and even piety. She wondered about the man called Thomas, the Soviet handler who had given Pemberton the Bible, and whether he had ever been identified or brought to justice. Years later, in 1963, Sister Mary Catherine received a visit from a man she did not initially recognize. He was in his late 30s, wearing a well-tailored suit, and he introduced himself as David Pemberton, Arthur's nephew, the executor who had arranged for the books to be donated to the monastery. He asked if he could speak with her privately, and Mother Bernadette, who by then knew the full story, arranged for them to meet in the same parlor where Sister Mary Catherine had first met the FBI agents. David Pemberton was polite but clearly troubled. He explained that he had recently learned, through sources he could not fully disclose, that his uncle had been involved in espionage, and that something discovered at St. Bartholomew's had been crucial to unraveling that activity. He had come seeking answers, trying to understand how the uncle he had known, a man who had seemed so upright and principled, could have led such a duplicitous life. Sister Mary Catherine, after confirming with the FBI that she could speak generally about the matter without compromising ongoing security concerns, told him about the Bible. She described how the coded messages had been hidden in the underlined words, how she had decoded them, and how they had revealed the extent of his uncle's betrayal. She did not share specific details about the intelligence that had been compromised or the names of other agents who had been identified. David Pemberton listened with visible pain etched on his face. When she finished, he sat in silence for several minutes, struggling to reconcile this information with his memories of his uncle. Finally, he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. He said that Arthur had always been a complex man, brilliant and charming, but also secretive and sometimes bitter. He had traveled extensively in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, ostensibly for diplomatic work, and had returned with what David now recognized as a troubling sympathy for communist ideology. But David had never imagined that sympathy had turned into active betrayal. He thanked Sister Mary Catherine for her honesty and for her service to the country in uncovering the truth. Before he left, he made a substantial donation to the monastery, a gesture of gratitude and perhaps also of contrition, an attempt to atone in some small way for the damage his uncle had caused. The Cold War continued for decades after that winter morning when Sister Mary Catherine first opened Arthur Pemberton's Bible. The struggle between East and West played out in proxy wars, diplomatic crises, and the constant shadow of nuclear annihilation. Intelligence agencies on both sides continued their secret battles, recruiting agents, stealing secrets, and working to stay one step ahead of their adversaries. The public knew only fragments of this hidden war, occasional headlines about defectors or exposed spy rings, never the full scope of the operations that shaped the balance of power. Sister Mary Catherine returned to her quiet work in the library, cataloguing books and maintaining the monastery's collection. She never sought recognition for her role in the investigation, never spoke publicly about what she had discovered. To the other sisters in the community, she remained simply Sister Mary Catherine, the librarian with the sharp mind and gentle manner who could answer any question about the collection. But she carried with her a deeper understanding of how duty could manifest in unexpected ways. She had learned that contemplative life did not mean detachment from moral responsibility, that even in withdrawal from the world, one could be called to serve the cause of truth and justice. The analytical skills she had once thought would be used only for theological scholarship had instead been the tools God used to protect her country from harm. In her later years, as the Cold War finally ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, Sister Mary Catherine would sometimes reflect on the strange providence that had placed that particular Bible in her hands. Of all the books in Arthur Pemberton's collection, of all the donated volumes that had passed through the monastery over the decades, this one had come to her at precisely the moment when she could recognize its significance. Another librarian might have missed the faint pencil marks, might have catalogued the Bible without noticing anything unusual. But her particular combination of attention to detail, analytical thinking, and patient persistence had made her the right person to uncover the hidden code. She thought about the butterfly effect of small discoveries, how a few underlined words in an old Bible had led to the arrest of Soviet agents, the protection of classified information, and perhaps the saving of lives. She thought about the thousands of unknown individuals in intelligence agencies and military service and ordinary civilian life, whose contributions to the Cold War would never be publicly acknowledged, but whose work had been essential to preserving freedom. The stone walls of St. Bartholomew's Monastery had witnessed 3 centuries of history before that February morning in 1958, and they would witness many more years to come. Within those walls, generations of sisters would continue their life of prayer and work, seemingly removed from the great events of the world. But Sister Mary Catherine knew, with a certainty born of experience, that no life is truly separate from history, that the call to serve can come in the most unexpected forms, and that even the quietest existence can have profound impact. The basement library where she had first examined the Bible remained much as it had been that winter day. The same stone walls, the same dim lighting, the same shelves lined with volumes spanning centuries. But for Sister Mary Catherine, the space held a different meaning now. It was not just a place of contemplative scholarship, but also the site where she had played a small but significant role in one of the great struggles of the 20th century. She never learned the full extent of what her discovery had prevented, never knew all the ramifications of the intelligence she had helped uncover, The FBI briefings had given her glimpses, but the full picture remained classified, hidden in files that might not be opened for decades or even generations. But she understood enough to know that her work had mattered, that the hours spent decoding those messages had served a purpose larger than herself. In the decades that followed, as new crises emerged and the world faced new challenges, Sister Mary Catherine continued her work in the library with the same methodical care she had always brought to the task. Each book that passed through her hands received her full attention. Each volume was examined and catalogued with precision. She never found another coded Bible, never uncovered another spy's secrets. But she remained alert to the possibility, understanding that vigilance was part of her calling, that her duty extended beyond the spiritual realm into the practical work of protecting truth and opposing deception. The story of how a nun in a monastery library had helped break up a Soviet spy ring became one of those Cold War secrets that existed in the shadows, known to a handful of FBI agents and intelligence officials, but never entering the public record. Sister Mary Catherine preferred it that way. She had not sought adventure or recognition, had not wanted her life to become entangled with matters of espionage and national security. But when duty had called, when she had been confronted with evidence that demanded action, she had not hesitated. Her faith had taught her that God works through ordinary people in ordinary circumstances, that the great movements of history are shaped not just by leaders and famous figures, but by countless individuals making moral choices in quiet moments. Her discovery of the coded Bible had been one such moment, a test of her integrity and courage that came not in some dramatic setting, but in the simple act of cataloguing donated books in a monastery basement. As she grew older, approaching the end of her earthly journey, Sister Mary Catherine would sometimes take out the notebook where she had first written down the underlined words from Pemberton's Bible. The FBI had returned it to her after the investigation concluded. The pages, now declassified since the information they contained, had long since been superseded by events. She would read through her careful notations, remembering that February day when her world had suddenly expanded to encompass matters she had never imagined confronting. The notebook reminded her that her life, lived almost entirely within the boundaries of the monastery, had nonetheless touched the wider world in meaningful ways. It reminded her that contemplation and action were not opposites, but complements, that the life of prayer and the life of service were ultimately one life lived in response to God's call. It reminded her that even in the cloistered quiet of religious community, even in the seemingly mundane work of maintaining a library, one could encounter profound moral challenges and be called to make choices that mattered. The Cold War had been a struggle fought on many fronts, some visible and some hidden, some dramatic and some quiet. Sister Mary Catherine's contribution had been small in the grand scheme of that conflict, but it had been real, and it had made a difference. The agents whose identities she had helped uncover had been removed from positions where they could do further harm. The classified information they had compromised had been protected through new security measures. And perhaps most importantly, the investigation her discovery had enabled had sent a message to Soviet intelligence that their operations were not undetectable, that even their most carefully constructed cover stories and communication methods could be penetrated. In the final accounting of history, when scholars would eventually gain access to the classified files and write their comprehensive accounts of Cold War espionage, Sister Mary Catherine's role might be reduced to a footnote, a brief mention of how FBI counterintelligence had obtained a crucial break in a spy case. But to those who knew the full story, to the agents who had worked with her, and the officials who had seen the intelligence her discovery had produced, she would always be remembered as an unlikely hero, a woman whose analytical mind and moral courage had served her country in its hour of need. The monastery library stood as her legacy, shelves upon shelves of books carefully maintained and catalogued, a repository of knowledge that served the community and honored the life of the mind. But she knew that her true legacy was not visible in that physical space. It lived in the actions she had taken that winter morning, in her decision to report what she had found rather than ignore it, in her willingness to step outside her comfortable routine to serve a larger cause. It lived in the example she had set for how ordinary people, in ordinary circumstances, could make extraordinary contributions when confronted with the choice between convenience and duty. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.